Today's lecture is underwritten by the Boyle Family Lectureship Fund and by PNC. The Boyles' participation at Chautauqua was legendary. Ed Boyle was an institution trustee and director of the Chautauqua Foundation. Helen was a founding supporter of the Abrahamic program in religion. And while the Boyles are no longer with us, their children, Mary, Michael, Mig, Patrick, John, and Peter, continue their parents' love of Chautauqua. PNC Financial Services Group is one of the nation's largest diversified financial services organizations. For more than 150 years, PNC has committed to great service and is proud of their long-standing history of supporting the communities they serve. Today marks the 22nd annual PNC Day at Chautauqua. Please join me in thanking both Boyle family and PNC for their contributions to the institution. Now to our speaker. Dr. Kathleen Hicks is Senior Vice President and the Henry A. Kissinger Chair, also the Director of International Security Program at CSIS. Dr. Hicks is a frequent writer and lecturer on U.S. foreign and security policy and strategic futures. Before joining CSIS, she served in the Department of Defense as Principal Deputy Undersecretary for Policy and in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Dr. Hicks received numerous recognitions for her service in the Defense Department, including distinguished awards from 3 Secretaries of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. She also received the 2011 DoD Senior Professional Women's Association Excellence in Leadership Award. Dr. Hicks was a presidentially appointed commissioner for the National Commission on the Future of the Army. She graduated magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa from Mount Holyoke College and later received an NPA from the University of Maryland and a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In our research on today's speaker, one of my colleagues wrote to me, "She really does remain impressively bipartisan in providing her thoughts on the world." That's just the type of speaker we love to find for Chautauqua. Dr. Hicks is joined on her first visit to Chautauqua by her husband, Tom, their children, Ben, Maggie, and Alex, and 2 very sweet dogs. And I reminded her that Chautauquans do love dogs. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hicks to Chautauqua.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you all, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you on such a beautiful day here at Chautauqua. I'm told it's always this beautiful, so I'm glad to experience it. I'm going to spend a little time this morning talking about CSIS as an institution, and then just to give you a flavor for the week, since I'm the first of our speakers for the week. And then I'll spend the rest of the time talking about subjects that are somewhat uncomfortable in the United States today, the polarization of our politics, and how that affects what's going on in the world and how those combined affect U.S. foreign policy. So first, a little about CSIS. What is CSIS? Well, as Michael said, we are a not-for-profit policy research organization founded over 50 years ago. And our mission is pretty simple, we think, to provide analysis so that policymakers can make informed decisions based on facts. Our core values are bipartisanship, intellectual independence, and analytic rigor. We like to think we start with the questions and not with the answers. Our boss and CEO, Dr. John Hamre, likes to say, everything in the world started as an idea in someone's head. And what think tanks do is we like to think that we take those ideas and we try to help shape policy agendas. We try to mobilize expertise and put forward evidence. We push for innovative change and build networks and communities through which to nurture and spread ideas and catalyze action. How do we do it? Well, some of the pictures up here show you some of the ways we try to do it. We write, we talk, we convene, we educate, we hope we inform, and we hope we listen. We work behind closed doors to encourage hard conversations, and we provide public platforms for important discussions. Our funding comes from governments, private foundations, individuals, and corporate sponsors. When we write a report or hold an event, we tell you who funded our work, so you can make informed decisions about what you read and what you hear. There are think tanks all around the world, and we believe they are an expression of an informed civil society, just like Chautauqua. You've probably encountered a think tanker and maybe didn't even know it. Maybe these sorts of pictures make you think of something. Ever wonder where talking heads come from? Well, a lot of them come from think tanks. These days, a lot of them come from journalism, but experts often come from the think tank world. We have a staff at CSIS of more than 220 full-time employees, a large network of non-resident affiliated scholars, and a world-class board of trustees. And we all share a common purpose to build a better, safer, and more prosperous world. Our board of trustees is a who's who of American foreign policy thought, from Henry Kissinger to giants of the Senate like Sam Nunn to major philanthropists like former CARE CEO Helene Gayle. By and large, we're practitioners, and what I mean by that is we don't just study areas. Our experts have worked in government and/or the private sector, contributing directly to thought leadership and policy implementation. And we reach stakeholders however we can, through television, but also through the internet, through social media, through print media, and through congressional testimony. And these are just some of the statistics up here of what we tend to get in terms of our social media and internet content direct communication. So for instance, we have over 1 million visitors a month to our website. CSIS has been ranked as the world's #1 think tank in defense and national security by the University of Pennsylvania's Go-To Think Tank Index 6 years in a row. And you'd think all these statistics would make us feel really fantastic, but often what it feels like in Washington these days is more like this. It is very lonely to be a fact-based bipartisan think tank in Washington. And that brings us to the topic of today's discussion, which is what is the connection between our domestic politics, world affairs, and the future conduct of US foreign policy? I think everybody probably intuitively knows just by turning on the news some basic ideas in their heads about how polarized we are. So I'm just going to put up a couple slides to give you a sense of how you see that. If you can't see the slides, I'm going to talk through everything you see here today, so don't worry about it. But here's 2 graphics. On the left-hand side, what you see is that since 1994, there's been a more than 20% rise in the percent of the US population polled that holds unfavorable or very unfavorable views of the other political party. Note that the percent of the very unfavorable views has jumped even further within that total by about 30% over that period of time. Why is this happening? I'm not going to be able to answer that for you today. That's a different week. But there probably are many causes that relate to our two-party system, money in politics, disparities in income, education, culture, and geography, and the rise of global information networks. But I do want to highlight one item. This may be an indicator or a contributor, or both, and that's how we get our information. According to a 2016 Pew poll, 6 in 10 Americans get their news from social media. And on the left side of the slide, you'll see that for many Americans, those feeds are self-reinforcing. They represent, in other words, just one side on many issues. The graph on the right shows that, that a surprising number of those polled across the political spectrum think this is okay to get one side of the news story. This is particularly true on the left and right ends of the political spectrum. Now, this is a 2016 poll, and by this polling, it looks worse for sure on the right end of the spectrum, with over 50% of those polled who identify as conservative Republicans saying it's okay to get just one side of a discussion. I think this is probably underrepresenting the left end of the spectrum, particularly since the election, as it is my anecdotal view that many on the left are soothing themselves, likewise with self-reinforcing messages as well. So what's the effect on foreign policy? Well, foreign policy actually, traditionally in the United States, has been an area of broad bipartisan consensus. It's thus probably one of the last areas in which we are feeling polarization, but we are feeling polarization. We have long had a common viewpoint on the big question, which is a need for US leadership in the world and the importance of engaging the world. I'm going to come back to this theme later. But it is changing, and how Americans view foreign policy is becoming much more politicized. So what I want to do is run for you a short video, it's about 4 minutes, that we built at CSIS following the 2016 election that ties together these threads of polarization, world events, and changing opinions on US foreign policy.
I believe in strong alliances, clarity in dealing with our rivals.
Or is the very last
and I take the oil.
Populism, border walls, retrenchment, and protectionism. While foreign policy is often overshadowed by economic concerns, contrasting visions of America's role in the world have played a major part in the recent election cycle. This contentious campaign season saw some of the basic tenets of U.S. foreign policy since the end of World War II called into question. Does this heightened acrimony over key aspects of U.S. international engagement reflect trends toward isolationism? It may seem unprecedented, but it is in fact not new. Today's controversies are continuations of debates that have lasted for decades. While support for the nation playing an active part in global affairs has remained strong since 1947, public opinion on key components of U.S. international engagement, such as defense spending, has waxed and waned over the last 70 years in response to economic trends, military interventions, and domestic priorities. In the first decades of the Cold War, America was committed to international engagement as a part of its strategy of containment against the existential threat presented by the Soviet Union. The U.S. experience in Vietnam, however, created an aversion to overseas military engagements that lasted from the late 1960s through the 70s. During the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union led the U.S. public and policymakers to again question defense spending levels, foreign aid, and forward military presence. Many thought the limited interventions of Desert Storm in Kosovo would serve as models for future military operations. Then came September 11, 2001. Our response to the events of that day have largely defined contemporary American foreign policy since. First came the long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Their unsatisfactory outcomes left much of the public and policymaking elites disillusioned with large-scale military engagements. The result of that disillusionment has been an increasing reliance on small footprint forces for a variety of contingency operations, including in the global war on terror. At home, the most severe recession since the Great Depression exacerbated America's growing reservations about global engagement. As the economy recovered at an anemic pace, income inequality ballooned. Fewer were able to reap the benefits of our globalized economy. Opposition to free trade and large-scale immigration grew. Now, 8 years after the recession and the more than 15 after 9/11, views on the desirability of America's international engagement strategy are fractured. For the first time ever in 2009 and again in 2013, most Americans responded that the U.S. should mind its own business internationally and let other countries get along the best they can on their own. This comes at the same time that more people are concerned about major domestic terror attacks than in 2002, just months after 9/11. Do these polls reflect temporary reactions to the state of public affairs? Or is there a genuine trend toward retrenchment in the American public? Democrats and Republicans now disagree on the benefits of free trade, alliances, and multilateral approaches. Divergences in threat perceptions and approaches to international engagement have also grown between the American public and policymakers. As history shows, this is not a new debate in American politics. Yet, as distance from World War II and the Cold War grows, the rationale for U.S. foreign policy of engagement may be growing less clear to younger generations. If the new administration decides that sustaining a strategy premised on deep international engagement is best suited for the advancement of American interests, it will have to do a better job of communicating the rationale for those policies to create a foreign policy the American public can get behind. If, on the other hand, the new administration seeks to chart a new course for American foreign policy, it will have to find avenues of consensus among an increasingly fractured public.
Okay, I know those charts go by very fast. If you want to pull up and pause the video. You simply Google CSIS populism video. CSIS populism video, and you can pull it up on any device and pause it as you go if you want to look at some of those charts. The sources for the polling data you see in there are two major sources. One is the Pew poll, and the other is the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs. Those are the two most reliable and long-standing polls that are done typically on an annual basis with regard to U.S. views on foreign policy. But let's now dig into some of the issues that we saw in there, some of the trends we're seeing in the world around us. Then we're going to come back to the U.S., some of the trends inside the U.S., and then we're going to end with a little bit on what we think we can do about it. So starting overseas, probably one of the biggest issues that folks will be hearing about and have heard about over the past 4 years is the Syrian civil war. And one of the reasons for that is it stands at the intersection of many of the world's most complex problems. The civil war in Syria started as a manifestation, the Syrian manifestation of the Arab Spring, with the government under Assad brutally cracking down on peaceful protesters. Since that time, the country has essentially become incapacitated. There are over 6 million Syrians that are internally displaced inside Syria, and another 5 million Syrians who have fled abroad. They've largely gone to Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, but beyond that, I'm sure, as you know, they have fled into Europe and a very small number into the United States. Key nations are on opposing sides inside Syria, which is another reason this is such a complex area. You have Iran and Russia backing the Assad regime, while the US, Europe, and Gulf states, Arab Gulf states seek a change of regime through a negotiated peace settlement that would remove Assad from power. And you also have all of these actors now operating in a military sense inside Syria, so that you have a very crowded battle space that is fraught with risk. And you've seen, of course, the Turks have shot down a Russian jet, the United States has shot down a Syrian jet, the US and Russians have deconfliction efforts underway, very fraught with risk. The US-led coalition inside Syria is fighting the Islamic State inside Syria and Iraq, and Russia, Iran, and Syria are nominally doing the same thing while also striking at opposition forces that are supported by the US coalition. And I'm sure, as you know, back in April, the United States undertook a limited strike against a Syrian air base in retaliation for that regime's use of chemical weapons against its own citizens. Very complicated situation, and it will have very long-term effects. The UN experts who look at migration, refugee issues, displacement, will tell you that it will take easily 10 years from the moment you get a standing ceasefire, a long-term political settlement, 10 years to get people back to their homes. So even if the Syrian conflict stopped today, and there is no sign that it is going to, 10 years from now, at a minimum, before you actually see that 11 million person population shift back into some kind of steady state population base. Probably at the top of most Americans, your average American's list of foreign policy concerns begins in Syria in a sense, but it's global in nature, and that is a concern about terrorism. It definitely tops the list in those polls that I mentioned of Americans' concerns about foreign policy. And they're really concerned these days about this Islamic State effort that began in Syria, rolled into Iraq, and has now transformed into a global phenomenon that many are concerned will threaten us at home and has threatened us at home. The Iraqi government, with significant support from the US-led coalition, recently retook the city of Mosul, and that was the last stronghold for the Islamic State inside Iraq. So all eyes are now turned in on Syria's city of Raqqa, which is the Islamic State's self-declared caliphate capital. But even if that issue set resolves, and I think the United States-led coalition will be able to retake Raqqa, major cells for the Islamic State exist today in Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, and of course there's this threat of homegrown terrorists that are inspired by the Islamic State, just as we had terrorists who were inspired by Al-Qaeda. And we have seen these cells strike in places like Belgium, France, the United Kingdom, and of course the United States. We will likely see continuing terrorist threats at home and around the world, whether it's under the label of Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, or some new manifestation. I think we should anticipate that this is an aspect of our international environment that will continue into the future. The drivers for that are going to continue to exist, and those include the ability to disseminate messages via social media and the internet, the low-cost and low-tech approaches that are available to nevertheless achieve strategic effects. So think about people driving trucks into crowds and a strategic effect they feel they get from that at very low cost in technology. Also, there is truly a greater accessibility of what I would consider much more sophisticated militarily relevant technology. But it's becoming more and more dissipated through the environment. And that includes things like 3D printing capability for, say, if you want to make guns. It includes cheap drones that you can weaponize. And there's also, of course, those more long-term and enduring aspects of inadequate local governance, poor economies, poor youth employment, and festering local grievances caused by other issues. If we move over to China, we have China continuing to invest significant resources in its military, developing capabilities that are clearly designed to prevent the United States and/or its allies from opposing Chinese will in East Asia. And increasingly, those capabilities are developing that allow it to extend its influence beyond East Asia, although very much its focus today more locally. And China in that region has been challenging the normal rules of basic rules of law by claiming and building out land features, sometimes you'll hear these called islands, in the South and East China Sea, and taking on territorial disputes by sort of assertion of ownership and building out military capability on them. We are increasingly seeing these kinds of, some people call them gray area or gray zone or hybrid challenges coming from China, from Russia, which I'll talk about in a moment, obviously terrorism itself, and from other actors. This is simply what it means is that smart adversaries realize where the US is strong, which is we have strong conventional, for instance, military capability, and they seek to come in below a threshold at which we would use any of that capability. So they're using lots of new tools in order to deter our engagement. In some areas, Russia is a pacing threat for the United States military, and I'll talk about those in a minute, but in almost every area, China is the pacing threat. And so when the United States thinks ahead over the next 20 years about the type of military capability it needs, and it's thinking on the technology side and high-end capability side, conventionally, it's thinking about China and China's growth in capabilities. Let's talk about Russia. You may have heard in the news recently that Russia's been a little busy. They are a power in decline, unlike China, which is a power on the rise. Scott Kennedy's going to come tomorrow and talk to you about China. Russia's clearly a power on the decline. But just because it's a power that's declining doesn't mean it isn't dangerous. And in fact, history has demonstrated that it's often the opposite that's true. Think of a Japan entry into World War II as an example. Powers that decline sometimes like to go out with a bang, or they like to, in the case of Russia, extract as much as possible before their power is diminished. So Russia, by and large, has been playing a spoiler role in the international community, and particularly against US and European interests. Like China, it is challenging the rule of law. It did so most obviously, but not singularly, by invading its neighbor Ukraine in January 2014 and then annexing the Ukrainian region of Crimea. It then went on, of course, to expand its military engagement in Syria. Russia's had a long-standing military presence in Syria, though it was very small before it expanded that presence in the 2015 particularly period. Toward the United States, Ukraine, and Europe, we have seen a poor man's playbook, a very effective one, of energy and economic manipulation, corruption, information warfare, little green men deployments, conventional military harassments, nuclear saber rattling, and cyber campaigns, all of which are designed, in my opinion, to achieve Russia's goal of maintaining power for the oligarchs at the center for as long as possible. Simply put, from a Russian perspective, government perspective, when the US looks bad, the Russian government looks good to the Russian people, and that helps keep them in power longer. Two other perennial nations of concern from a US security perspective are North Korea and Iran. In the case of North Korea, we have a long-standing legacy of the Kim dynasty, undertaking a series of calculated unpredictability provocations, brutal internal repression, nuclear development, so they have a small nuclear arsenal at this point, and as you've seen most recently, and particularly under Kim Jong-un, a very aggressive long-range missile development program. It's a pretty impressive deterrent. If you hear anything about North Korea from experts like me, or even more informed experts on North Korea, what you're going to hear is that's a really hard problem to solve. So I think maybe a bottom line way to say this, which is, we don't often like to say as experts in the US where we think we can solve all problems, is North Korea did a pretty good job of building a deterrent that keeps everybody out. And so they go on, repressing their citizens, developing their capability, and I think the big question with North Korea is, will they contain that, or will they seek to conduct hostile acts against, for instance, South Korea, where the United States has about 100,000 citizens, 30,000 of which are US military personnel living. Japan, which is well within its missile range, and against which North Korea has made many threats, or elsewhere in the world. In the case of Iran, it's more complicated. There's an internal struggle, not allowed in North Korea, but an internal struggle inside Iran between moderates and hardliners. This is a simplified way of putting it. I think when John Alterman speaks to you about the Middle East later in the week, he can break this open a bit more. But for purposes of just describing the Iranian threat, from a security perspective, we have these regional tensions that are very long-standing between the Shia Persian Iranian Empire and the Arab states that are Sunni. And there is a sort of a debate in the region about the degree to which this is about the divide between Shia and Sunni, or the divide between the Arab world and the Persian world, the latter being a more long-standing challenge of balance. So you have these regional balance challenges. Israel, the Arab states, the United States, generally speaking, have been very concerned about any growth of Iranian capability. And what are the Iranians doing? Well, they're actually not investing a lot in a conventional military capability. What they're doing is investing in unconventional capabilities. Its deterrent strategy, then, is a little different than some of these other actors. It's doing support for terrorism. It has a very aggressive information warfare campaign. It has cyber efforts, and I'm going to talk more about cyber and actors in a moment. And like North Korea, it's developing its missiles. So it also has a little bit, if you will, less expensive approach to how it deters actors from wanting to tussle with Iran. All of this is taking place against a backdrop of increasing connectivity of our world. Let's just take for one measure the number of smartphone users in the world. Today, in the United States, 77% of Americans own a smartphone. And across the world, there are 2.6 billion smartphone subscriptions. That growth has been leveling off in some of the developed markets, such as the United States and Europe. It's not stalling there at all, but it is slowing down. But by 2020, globally, there will be 6.1 billion smartphone users. And this will be led by huge growth in less mature markets. In fact, smartphones will finally overtake the number of active fixed line subscriptions worldwide in 2020, which is just around the corner. So this is a quick snapshot that gives you a sense of how the world, if you will, can light up with information immediately. This is for the good, it's for the ill, it just is. And so this is a truly 21st century facet of our security environment. Here's one of the ways it's for the ill. We all know that connectivity can be weaponized. We've seen that. And this graphic shows you a depiction drawn from the New York Times of how Russia was able to hopscotch, if you will, across platforms and modes and means to undertake some weaponization. But Russia's not the only actor, so I'm going to focus on some others so we don't think of this as a Russia issue. You may recall we had the Sony Pictures hack that was attributed to North Korea. There was a hack of the Saudi oil company Aramco that was attributed to Iran. We had the hack of a US government employee identifying information that was attributed to China. And I think generally speaking, everyone knows from a corporate espionage perspective, the Chinese have been doing quite a bit of intellectual property theft from the United States and other actors. And of course, just this week, you probably saw news in the last 24 hours, I think even, that the United Arab Emirates has appeared to create fake news about its a rival, Qatar, in order to get sympathy for the UAE against Qatar in a basic regional rivalry. And by the way, I hope that no one thinks of us as weaponizing these things, but the United States is pretty darn good at cyber too. We have the capability, and we hope to always strive to be at the forefront of having the capability inside our government to use cyber as necessary to avoid the need to use kinetic weapons, meaning actual military hardware that would kill people. So the world is full of cyber actors, and I have only just named to you nation states. You all know that, for instance, the Islamic State exploits the use of social media quite effectively to recruit. And everything old is new again. Information operations are as old as warfare itself. What is new for the 21st century is back to that last slide, which is the incredible ease and degree of reach that you can have with information tools that was not accessible before the 21st century. Another major global trend often overlooked is urbanization. Today, the most urbanized regions of the world include North America, with 82% of our populations living in urban areas in 2014. Latin America and the Caribbean, where 80% also reside in urban areas, and Europe, where 73% of the population resides in urban areas. In contrast, Africa and Asia remain mostly rural, with 40 and 48% respectively living in urban areas. But all regions of the world are expected to urbanize even further over the coming decades. Africa and Asia, in fact, are urbanizing faster than other regions and are projected to become 56 and 64% urban, respectively, by 2050. And as this slide points out, the UN estimates 66% of the world's population overall will live in urban areas, generating the vast majority of gross domestic product in the world. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the side trends that will interact with urbanization. One of them is climate. Some of you may have heard or seen recent reports about a new study out last week that warned that biodiversity is being lost on a scale comparable to the era in which the dinosaurs went extinct. Just here in the United States, more than 90 coastal communities are battling chronic flooding, a number that is expected to roughly double to more than 170 communities in less than 20 years. So look at the intersection of the trend we just talked about, urbanization, and look at the locations that are flooding, that are growing in seawater levels, and you will start to see that many of these urbanizing areas, of course, are occurring along waterways. Why wouldn't you have a city occur on a waterway? These are the very areas that are most likely to be hit earliest by these trend lines in climate change. These combination of factors create the risks for humanitarian disasters. Think of major tsunamis that you've seen in the past, for example, in Asia. Think about the size of populations growing in those areas. Now combine that with this growth in Asia and Africa. Many of these large urban areas will start to expand where their governance capacity of a country is least. So you may have a country like Nigeria, for instance, where the governance capacity is not exceptionally high, having major cities like Lagos that sit on water with climate changes. you can expect to see some significant humanitarian effects of this combination of factors. And of course, there's also resource scarcity. We have resource scarcity anyway. I do think climate is exacerbating that. So urban areas aren't the only ones that will be affected. The New York Times recently reported that for the first time since anyone can remember, there is the possibility of 4 famines, Somalia, Nigeria, South Sudan, and Yemen, breaking out at once, which would endanger more than 20 million lives. By 2050, world population will increase from 7.3 billion to 9.7 billion, with more than half of this growth occurring in Africa. Meat consumption is projected to rise nearly 73%, and dairy consumption by 58% over 2010 levels over that period. It's been calculated that global agricultural productivity must grow by an average rate of at least 1.75% annually in order to meet the attendant need to double agricultural output by 2050. We are not on pace to make those levels of productivity gains. And while output of food, feed, fiber, and fuel will most likely continue to rise in coming decades to meet the growing global demand, experts are concerned that this production will come at the expense of the environment and natural resource base. In addition, agricultural production of livestock and crops contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, further accelerating climate change. Okay, I know this is a deeply depressing talk. So here come the good news slides. This is not all bad. The international system is succeeding in very, very important ways that I want to highlight. Probably the most significant factor is that global poverty rates are dropping precipitously. Something is going right in the international system. What this graph shows you is from 1990 to 2015. I apologize, I don't have my glasses on. We have had a drop from a 37% global poverty level to a little less than 10% global poverty level. That's impressive. That's impressive. Life expectancy is also getting much better around the world. We have gone from a worldwide life expectancy of about 48 years in 1950 to about 68 years projected for 2050. In the developed world, it's going to go to about 83 years in 2050. Again, a significant growth in health and prosperity as measured by poverty rates going down and life expectancy going up. Another good news story in general would be this study that indicates, and I think many would agree, that on average we're having many fewer people killed by violent conflict. Now, I do have to pause in my good news to say this slide stops at 2010, so it does not take into account Syria. But if you take Syria out of the picture and think about this trend line, the number of human beings who are being killed in major wars is significantly declining since the end of World War II. These are good trends, and we want to make those kinds of trends continue. I'm going to talk in a few slides about some of the ways U.S. foreign policy can help to strengthen those trends. But let's kind of come home and talk a little bit first about what we're seeing in the United States that may be affecting how we are thinking as a community, as a nation, about our foreign policy. So the United States is still a tremendously strong country. Our military, our innovation in industry, the number of patents we pursue, our energy resources, our educated population, the demographics of the nation. We're a strong country. Here's one measure. In 2015, the United States had the largest GDP in the world. But here's something I think we all know now. We had the third largest income gap in 2015 in the world. This prosperity is clearly not being shared across the United States, and this is part of the issue with how we think about our foreign policy. This is a graphic that gives you a sense of trade. Trade's been a huge issue in the United States, on the left and the right, in the last presidential election in particular. 20% of US agricultural production is exported. That's a huge market for the United States. Our agriculture industry, as just one sector, is heavily dependent on trade. And at the same time, as consumers, we're very dependent on a global supply chain. That's happening from our airplanes, to the products you're picking up at Walmart, to our iPhones. This is a graphic that just gives you a sense of the range of countries that have contributing components or production facilities related to the building of an iPhone. It includes the US, various countries in Europe, China, and others for one iPhone. It's very hard these days to find something and say this is made in America or this is made overseas. Most things that we acquire or have are made from lots of different components that are built in various parts of the world, further complicating this issue of us and them, trade, no trade, US made, foreign made. So let's also talk about automation. It's gotten a lot less attention, I think, but since the election, I think it's gotten more. It takes about $25 to pay a human to spot weld. It takes a robot $8. That's what you'd have to pay in production. Immigration's another one. A lot of talk about immigration. We are actually a very divided nation on immigration. This is from an October 2016 poll. 45% of those polled, Americans all, say having more immigrant workers hurts Americans. 42% say this trend helps US workers. Very divided landscape. About 15% of the US population today is immigrant. It's basically the same as where it was in 1920, but it's essentially at the highest point since about then. So we have seen immigration come down, and it's coming back up to about the level it was pre-World War II. The vast majority of these immigrants, when I'm using those numbers, are legal immigrants. The statistics are hard to corroborate, but at least 75% of those immigration totals are legal immigration. So what are we seeing through this combination of, for instance, automation, trade concerns, immigration concerns? What might we be seeing? Well, I wanted to highlight in a short video, it's just about a minute and 40 seconds or so, a trucker named Robert. And this is a clip of a film that The Economist put together. And it gives you Robert's perspective of some of the issues that are going on here. And what I want you to listen for, not only those issues I just mentioned, but the less tangible issues of culture that come up in this brief video.
A series of studies have found technology, not globalization, to be the biggest driver of inequality in developed countries. There are 3.5 million people employed in trucking in America. And with their industry seemingly the next in line for automation, many face an uncertain future. Robert Callista has driven trucks since the 1980s. Both his parents were truck drivers before him.
This job has fed my family. It's kept a roof over my family the whole time I've drove. It's my home on home. This is Peterbilt, and he was named after a truck called Peterbilt. You look at California, they're chasing so many of us companies out here, not just trucking companies, manufacturing companies, small business people. They're running us out of the state. You know, I deliver in Silicon Valley to several of the big computer companies. They're just more educated. They're there for themselves. They want the money. They don't want us. I voted for Trump because I wanted to change. Basically, telling the country, well, California, New York, we're sorry, but you don't control the country no more.
For those of you who are watching who could see the closed caption on there, I apologize that the British called Peterbilt Peter Bell. I think they didn't realize that Peterbilt was a truck company and thus the name of the cat. So let's pull some of these themes together. What are the effects that we're seeing? I'm not telling you anything you don't know. The one you all know is the rise of populism. And we're seeing that both globally and domestically. The picture here we have in the upper left, I believe it is, you have a picture of Syrian refugees leaving during a ceasefire, and I believe that's in Aleppo. As I said earlier, we're currently experiencing the largest human population displacement in recorded history since the end of, even including the end of World War II, excuse me. This is particularly having effects, as we know, in Europe, but also in the United States. People are concerned that these refugee flows are fueling terrorism, and they're also concerned that they're fueling strains on social systems, strains on economy, and of course there's anger over perceptions of threats to culture and heritage that are occurring. Combined with that, in some cases, it depends on where you are on the political spectrum, there are also these major issues around questions of unfair trade practice, questions about sovereignty, questions about have and have not. And so you're seeing from Brexit in the UK to the French election, which actually ultimately ended up, we think, in a less populist mode than it could have, to the US, that there is an outcome that is occurring from this some combination here of these cultural issues, these wealth disparity issues, these concerns about too much engagement overseas. And the backlash tends to be against, as I think Robert put it very well, against the coasts, against the so-called global elite establishment. And if you look at our last election cycle, as I said earlier, this is happening on the right and the left. They're different, but it's a very similar sentiment that the center, if you will, this consensus around how we should operate our domestic policy and then our foreign policy is crumbling. Overseas, you're seeing a rise of autocracy, and this is concerning for US foreign policy. Because if there's one thing the United States thinks it does in the world, it thinks it sets itself forward as a model for democracy that other nations will find appealing and will want to follow. This first of two slides is more of an anecdotal slide, which is just a sense of the number of prominent autocrats that you probably hear about on the TV news or read about in the paper. We have Erdogan in Turkey, we have Putin in Russia, we have Duterte in the Philippines, we have Maduros in Venezuela, and of course Kim Jong-un in North Korea. I don't have a picture up here of President Xi from China, but you may know there's been significant crackdowns, for example, in Hong Kong against democracy or pro-democracy protesters, much as there had been in Tiananmen Square in 1989. And that in general, Xi is tightening his grip on power, he's centralizing power. And again, Scott Kennedy can talk to you more about that tomorrow. So that's anecdotal. What's actually happening in terms of statistics? Well, the good news is we're not seeing a massive rise in autocracy around the world. The think tank Freedom House released a very influential report earlier this year that shows that gains from non-free states, meaning the number of states that they categorize at Freedom House as non-free, is small. But notable to Freedom House in their findings is that this is the first time since they have started building an index of freedom, since the 1980s, in which we have seen a decade where there has been any decline in free countries. So a very small decline in the number of countries that Freedom House identifies as non-free, but notable that it is rising. Okay, so the world's on fire. Thanks a lot. That was a nice way to start your Monday. Now what are we going to do about it? So I think it's very tempting for those of us in the foreign policy community, as well as any informed American, to want to just throw up your hands. But I do think there are some key factors that we can hold on to that are going to help us navigate this environment. There are three in particular that I want to touch on that I think are critical to shaping US foreign and security policy in the world and the domestic world included, that I have just described. So I'm going to talk about those, and then I'm going to talk about some of the aspects of our foreign policy that I think we need to have. First, I think it's really important to acknowledge this interesting paradox that the United States is living in which we have enduring superpower status combined with lessening influence. The United States will likely remain the world's sole superpower for at least the next 15 years. As I said earlier, our nation boasts enviable geography, meaning we're far from a lot of people, our demographics, economics and innovation, natural resources, cultural reach, and of course, alliances and military power. So we may be a superpower, but at the same time, somehow seems a little less satisfying to be a superpower these days. Our ability to shape the behavior of other actors feels limited, and I think in some cases really truly is limited. How well we choose to wield our power obviously is an important piece of this, our own choices in foreign policy. But I do think at its base level, how well we can do it varies very much by region of the world and type of issue we're talking about. And in particular, non-state problems are extremely difficult to tackle with our traditional strengths. Those strengths are state-to-state-based diplomacy, trade, massed military force. These are all things the United States has built very traditional strengths around, and they are helpful, but they are not particularly well suited to some of those non-state challenges we have talked about. Moreover, non-state challenges do us one worse. They test us where we are weakest: our impatience, our tendency toward unilateralism, and our lack of skill at integrating the instruments of US power. So where do those traits hurt our security interests? Well, in our ability, for instance, to drive long-term solutions, such as improved governance capacity in a place like Libya or Iraq, which takes a generational investment. Moreover, many of the best solutions to our problems require a combination of strengths, that integration. Problems are seldom solvable in just one sphere, for instance, just a trade policy, or for instance, unilaterally, just by the United States. Almost all the issues that we have just talked about here this morning and that we will face in the future will require us to integrate whole of government, as we like to say in Washington, meaning diplomacy, development, military, intelligence, information as examples, law enforcement. And they're multinational in nature. We cannot, for instance, solve climate on our own. We cannot solve terrorism challenges on our own. But we in the United States have proven neither particularly patient for nor adept at those kinds of approaches. Now, where are those traditional strengths still really resonating for us? Typically, it's where we have an assertive military competitor to the United States and its allies. So those nation-state threats I described above are taking on those kinds of challenges have been traditional strengths for the United States, and I think where our superpower status will continue to help us the longest. But even in those cases, the United States has had difficulty deterring a wide range of provocations and coercive actions counter to our security interests. I'm going to talk about that and how we can do that in a minute. So a second factor underlying a vision for future foreign policy is the threat of constancy in the American public's support of international engagement. If there is one American grand strategy that has persisted for the past 70 years, it is to advance US interests by taking a leading role in the world. Figures across the American political spectrum have seemed in their statements and actions to challenge the continued endurance of the instinct for some kind of international engagement. Most notably, of course, President Trump, as a candidate for office in particular. But the percent of the American population that is truly isolationist is very small. Those same polls that were in the first video that I showed you demonstrate that really it's only about 9% of the public. If you ask the question, essentially, should you be engaged abroad or not, only about 9% of the public are truly isolationist and don't want to have anything to do with the rest of the world. I think that reflects a general recognition that the most important interests we seek to secure in the world require us to be engaged and sometimes to lead. Republican and Democratic administrations have generally described America's world interests in remarkably consistent ways: ensuring the security of US territory and citizens, upholding treaty commitments to include the security of allies, ensuring a liberal economic order in which American enterprise can compete fairly, and upholding the rule of law in international affairs, which includes respect for human rights. Each administration has framed these issues somewhat differently, and most assuredly, each has executed on them quite differently to secure them. But the core tenets really have not varied significantly. Now, predictability and stability of position is not a hallmark of this administration so far, but for those of us who are reading the tea leaves very carefully on these issues, and we are, from the Trump National Security Team minus the president himself, you are seeing many of these vital interests re-articulated. That's as good as it's going to get. So, I'm at least willing to say the following, knowing that predictability is not exactly a smart thing to bank on these days. I do not believe an isolationist sentiment will ultimately upend the basic consensus view among Americans that what happens elsewhere in the world can affect us at home. So that doesn't mean that I believe that Americans' predilection for internationalism is unchecked, far from it. Indeed, my third factor for policymakers to consider in developing foreign policy approaches is that there is a near inevitability to the United States pursuing what some might call a selective engagement approach through its foreign policy. So yes, there is this majority viewpoint in support of international engagement of some kind, but the United States has never had the wherewithal nor the desire to act everywhere in the world all the time or with the same tools of power. Polling shows that the vast majority, say 70% of Americans prior to the last election, wanted the next president to focus more on national interests versus international issues. And that trend has only been increasing since the peak of military activity in Iraq and Afghanistan back in 2007. So that is a longer-term trend line that we are seeing. So we have always had to weigh risks and opportunity costs of engaging abroad, and we've always needed to prioritize investments in terms of our foreign policy. It is definitely harder in our current budget environment. And this graph, which I know is very difficult to see, I'm just going to describe it to you, shows that interest on our debt combined with mandatory spending, so all the colors you see up to this sort of mauvish pink, and then the dotted line above it, that's the interest on our debt in the dotted line cleared out area, and below that, that's mandatory spending. Everything else in the federal government, defense, EPA, state, the post office, Homeland Security, national parks, you name it, has to fit in that little wedge right there. And by the way, that wedge is going to go away because the interest on the debt is going to consume it. We don't have money right now in our budget to solve all these problems that I have just described to you. We probably never could, even if we didn't have all these other challenges to our economy. But we do have them. And we're going to be squeezed out of that what we call discretionary defense and non-defense discretionary spending by about 2036 under current projections, just the amount that we spend today. So, you know, we're not going to solve these problems that way, but we're also not going to retrench internally. What about the most divisive of foreign policy issues, which is use of force? And that is the area where Americans are most likely to disagree. And frankly, it's also the area where most Americans are least likely to be consistent internally. As Robert Gates, former Secretary of Defense, famously quipped in 2011, the United States has a perfect record in predicting our next crisis. We've never once got it right. Perhaps a little, many people would take issue with some of that, but I think his sentiment is certainly clear, which is that democracies, including the United States, can prove remarkably unpredictable in where and when we are willing to use force. And policymakers need to understand this reality and not lead the public to expect that there is a clear and universal template that governs when and where our population will seek to use force. Leaders can also work to reduce the risks of miscalculation that unpredictability can pose, which is important, and I will address that in a moment. Okay, so if American policymakers have the benefit of superpower status, but generally less ability to wield it effectively, if Americans generally agree that leading, or at least engaging abroad, is important to protect our interests, And if resource constraints, national character, and other factors limit us from seeking to aggressively or even particularly consistently take action overseas, especially military forces, what kind of foreign and security policy imperatives should essentially be de minimis? What are the must-dos for US foreign policy? I'm going to highlight 3 today as my takeaway to you. Of foremost importance is avoiding the hazards we are currently experiencing, which is domestic political polarization. Now, I understand that we are in a highly dysfunctional period in our politics, and that the foreign policy community that I represent is not likely to be the leading edge of resolving all tensions that divide us along partisan and other lines. But what we can do as a community, what my community can do, is come to people like you and warn about how the political dysfunction in the United States is creating a major strategic weakness for us overseas. When we are divided and we cannot come to a consistent foreign policy, we don't have a stable understanding of the resources that we have at our disposal to secure the US role in the world, and that cripples our ability to be truly strategic. I would point, for example, to the defense budget, which has been going through, pinging back and forth across numbers for about 5 years because we cannot get to a stable budget picture. Polarization also makes allies and partners extremely uneasy. Think about how American analysts would describe Libyan or Iraqi politics, and then turn the mirror back on ourselves and how we are projecting ourselves as a democracy functioning or otherwise at the moment. How can another country depend on our will and capacity to fulfill security commitments? And if they don't think they can, would we be pleased with the outcome? We might be happy that there aren't free riders, if you will, on American security commitments, but we might not be happy if they make other choices. Some of you may have seen out of the recent G20, Japan and the EU, for example, coming to an agreement on a major trade deal that looks a lot like the Asia trade deal that the US had been a party to, which was called TPP, but it's one that does not include the US. I'm not saying that TPP is right or wrong. I'm simply saying, are we really prepared for the outcome of letting others move forward without us because they don't think we are a trustworthy partner? Polarization also hampers our cultural appeal, the very dream of the American political system, making alternative models of economics and governance gain greater resonance abroad. And it creates then opportunities for foreign powers to undermine us. Finally, and I don't think many people pay attention to this issue, it's creating real problems in civil-military relations in the United States, which is a particular interest area of mine. It feeds a sense of isolation in the military, which truly struggles to understand why the political caste in this country can't put aside politics to get things done in a challenging world. In fact, we seem to be turning toward those in uniform to overcome weaknesses in our civilian governance, which is an extremely disheartening, if not corrosively dangerous situation for a democracy. Some of the areas of relative bipartisan agreement that I think we could work off of are cyber defense, global health, strong diplomacy, where you've seen, for example, Republicans on the Hill and Democrats on the Hill come together around the need for a strong State Department. Reasonable defense spending. Americans right now are in a very positive mood toward defense spending. Fair trade practices that get at some of those advantages I showed you earlier for the agricultural community as an example, but paired with fair trade approaches that protect our workers. And perhaps even alliances. I'm going to talk about alliances in just a moment. So the second imperative I'm going to put forward of the 3, however unglamorous and hard to measure, is that our foreign policy focus significant leadership, energy, and relative investment on problem prevention. This means that using our non-military instruments of statecraft is very important. It requires us to explain the value of development assistance and get better at measuring and wielding it. I hope you all know that less than 1% of the federal budget, for example, goes towards development assistance. We have to use our unparalleled diplomatic corps and partner and alliance outreach, and we have to promote private efforts that align with US policy goals, from global health, where, for instance, the Gates Foundation has been tremendously helpful, to climate and clean energy policy, to poverty reduction. The multitude of negative comments about allies made over the past year by President Obama, you may or may not recall, he had an article in The Atlantic in which he was quoted extensively saying not very nice things about our allies, and of course more consistently by President Trump, caused me to pause here to speak about the powerful asymmetric, meaning comparative advantage that the United States has in its alliance network. Alliances and partners can be a lot of work and money, sometimes feeling with little to show. So it's important to get the formula of lead but don't get suckered right. And I'd be happy to discuss this in more detail in the Q&A, but suffice it to say for the purposes of my argument, I believe that we have for sure, as the United States, gotten the good end of the deal for the past 70 years. And we should keep working to make that better, not let comments that come out of our officials undermine the enterprise entirely. I think it's fair to say that the goodwill has eroded in several key relationships, and there's incredible wariness among a variety of allies toward the United States at the moment. So it will be very important in order to achieve this goal I've just laid out of being invested in preventative policies to get the multilateral aspect of that right through our words and deeds. So the final imperative I want to mention is more on the hard security piece, and that is to improve our deterrence toolkit for provocations against our interests that fall short of war. The United States actually has an excellent record of deterring existential threats to us. But from Chinese coercion in the South and East China Seas to Russian subversion in its near abroad to our election, Iranian asymmetric tactics such as through proxy terrorist organizations, and in the Middle East, potential adversaries are attacking our interests in ways that fall below the threshold of traditional state-based military power. It's not new. It's also as old as warfare itself, just like information operations, but it's an increasing risk area for us, particularly with regard to the potential for miscalculation I warned of before. In some cases, such as in space and cyber interactions, the world does not have well-established understandings and legal frameworks. We don't have norms for how to operate together. In other areas, such as in the maritime, so with Chinese land reclamation activities, those frameworks that we have, even though there are rules for maritime claims, they're being actively tested. These trends together create the heightened risk of conflict, not so much from direct confrontation, although of course that is possible, North Korea being the most notable example, but from an increased chance that potential adversaries will inadvertently misinterpret US interests, willingness, and capability to respond to these provocations, even when indirect. I do not today believe that China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, or for that matter, any state seeks to precipitate a war with the United States. Nevertheless, as human history has shown, war may in fact occur. In the age of Trump, I believe his key foreign policy advisors must pay special heed to shaping the calculus of those states who wish to test our response to ambiguous challenges. This will mean clearly communicating those interests and our willingness and capacity to act in defense of them. And it also means carrying out threats when deterrence fails. I believe the instinct for deterring future chemical weapons challenges, for instance, was at the heart of the advice President Trump received in the run-up to his Tomahawk strikes on Syria. But it came less than a week after UN Ambassador Haley and other administration officials signaled a US acceptance of the Assad regime. One could say the US signaling was a little unclear in that case. It didn't take us long to go from a green light to a red line in Syria, and it's not the first time that's happened in US foreign policy. I'm sure many of you will recall that Dean Acheson discovered in Korea that effective signaling is significantly challenged by the domestic, political, and other realities that shape how and when the United States chooses to act in response to others' actions. So this ties into my earlier point about the inevitability of selective engagement. Others can't always predict what will motivate the US to reaction and what might slip by, nor frankly can we. Moreover, there's a cumulative effects problem wherein if we're doing too much or too little at some point, the pendulum of action can swing radically in the other direction and probably not exactly where we expect it to occur. Building that security consensus, that bipartisan security consensus I spoke of earlier, is critical in this regard, as is the preventive work we do to clearly signal what our intentions are and where our body politique is moving. At CSIS, we've recently completed a variety of studies on deterrent approaches for Russia, for China, and Iran. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about any of those, but if in the Q&A you'd like to discuss that, I'm happy to do so. Last slide. So advancing the 3 foreign policy imperatives I outlined today, and in particular successfully deterring threats to US interests from capable nation-state actors, will take an active, focused effort. It might be hard to hope for success, as it is dependent on attributes not normally associated with the current Washington political climate. That's political consensus in foreign policy, long-term, preventative, multidisciplinary, and multinational responses, and improved deterrence of so-called gray area challenges. There is no doubt that discerning the shifting nature of the international system and designing an effective set of American security tools within it are monumental tasks, but they're not unprecedented. It's the same task that faced the so-called wise men who helped shape the US approach to world affairs at the end of World War II. Our circumstances today are equally daunting, requiring a similar re-examination of our strategies and capabilities. The now what era of US foreign policy is upon us. We need to rebuild a common ground on which to address these issues. As you can see, I have rebuilt the common ground on this slide. These bears may be looking to nuzzle noses, or they may be looking to eat each other alive, and that might be us. But at least we'll be doing it together, and after all, isn't that the purpose of a nation? Thank you very much. Oh, I stay here. Sorry, I stay here.
I want to thank Dr. Hicks for providing us such an important frame for this week. We have run out of time for questions, but she will be with us at the Women's Club on Wednesday. So I encourage those of you that would like to ask some deeper questions to join us there on Wednesday, and we'll look forward to the conversation this week. Please join me in thanking Dr. Hicks again.